If I told you that Big Sur and Black Mesa had something in common, you would nod your head and agree that, yes, both are state parks in the United States. Then I would tell you that I'm not talking about Black Mesa State Park, but instead the fan-made Half-Life remake by Crowbar Collective. At this point you might be confused as to why I'm making a comparison between a geographical region and a video game, so let me provide some context. In early August, I visited Big Sur to camp for a few nights and disconnect from the world. The exact details of the stay itself aren't relevant, but what I felt while I was there does matter. As a fairly remote location with few amenities, Wi-Fi and cell service especially is hard to come by. In this scenario, it was great because it helped me get away from electronics for a few days. That's something that's pretty difficult to do in the 21st century. Of course, your phone is pretty much useless without any form of internet connection. There are still some features that do work properly regardless of whether or not you have cellular data, such as listening to downloaded music. While taking in nature and listening to birds is all fine and dandy, there's also nothing wrong with leaning back and just listening to some tunes. I did exactly that while sitting on a beach nearby looking out at the Pacific Ocean. I wasn't really feeling a specific genre, so I decided to put on the kitchen sink that is my liked playlist on Spotify. Some of the songs that came on were fitting for the moment, such as Address Unknown by the Inkspots and Ericato by Windows 96. There were some less fitting songs in there too, like Finger Bib by Aphex Twin. Not bad, just not really fitting for the moment. Then one track came on that I've always loved. It was a track titled Convergence from the Black Mesa Zen soundtrack produced by Joel Nielsen. The track playing at that exact moment while the sun began to set at Pfeiffer Beach gave me a very ethereal feeling. It felt beautiful, and it was a moment to remember. On my flight back home from Los Angeles, I thought more about that moment, especially about Convergence and Black Mesa as a game. Yes, to confirm, after vacationing for a week in California and seeing what was probably the most beautiful scenery I've ever seen in my life, I was thinking about a video game. Society. When I got back home to the East Coast, I decided to replay the Zen portion of the game after nearly 4 years since its full release on Steam in 2020. What really hit me after replaying Black Mesa Zen was the pure emotion you feel while playing the late chapters of the game. You feel triumphant yet guilty after slaughtering aliens. You feel free yet anxious while long jumping across floating islands. And you revel in the sheer beauty of every nook and cranny throughout the dimension. All of these emotions culminated into the macaroni and beef sphere of thought that made me realize that Black Mesa is not simply an unbelievably beautiful game, but a testament to the fact that video games, much like paintings, music, and film, are equally valid as art. Here's why.
The definition of what art actually is
not something any one person can really answer. Yeah, you could do the thing that YouTubers do where you quote Merriam-Webster, but that glosses over the interpretive nature of art as a concept. One publication, Philosophy Now, attempted to answer this question with one of their Question of the Month issues, which invited people from all over the world to contribute their personal definitions of what art is. Each response was unique, but they all bore one critical, similar theme. That art was not defined by one single medium, and that it is largely an expression of human emotion, both positive and negative. Pieces in an art gallery could be considered art, but so could the doors and stairs of the building, unrelated to the exhibitions themselves. Black Mesa as a game is a truly impressive feat, for the sheer level of dedication and time spent to create a faithful, yet unique remake. To understand why it is representative of the artistry and love that goes into creating video games, I'm going to provide some brief background on its history. Crowbar Collective's interpretation of Zen is entirely different from the version in the original Half-Life. While Valve's breakthrough 1998 title was praised for its story, combat, AI, and so many other aspects, Zen was not as fondly remembered as the rest of the game. With Jules Grant of the Electric Playground stating, Half-Life's real-world environments were brilliantly designed, but these nether dimension levels are handedly beaten by the excellent alien environments of Unreal. In these end levels, the story is no longer important. There are no more of the fantastic cutscenes, no more interactions with NPCs, no more good AI. There is only Valve's mock-up of Purgatory and eerie wind noises. This review was just one of many that admonished Valve and its then small team for a lackluster ending. When looking at Black Mesa Zen, however, I'm sure they'd have a newfound appreciation for how their iteration allowed their original vision to come to light. It is known, however, that Valve rushed to complete their iteration of Zen, and in a weird way this might have actually been a good thing for the company. Patton Hindle wrote an article for artsy, which elaborates upon this idea, with the central focus being that artists should be allowed to fail. They state that what looks like a failure is often just the beginning of something else, often something more interesting. You can see this exact evolution in Half-Life 2. To a certain extent, this can be interpreted as failure leads to growth, albeit in a more nuanced manner. Examining Valve's newer games proves this point. They take a long time to develop, and they typically won't announce a project unless they are certain about its completion or if it is already nearly finished. This very idea has led to a popular community joke about Valve time, which makes fun of Valve's promised release dates compared to the actual timeline to release. There's little doubt this is a lesson they learned from the first Half-Life game given their rush to complete Xen for the release of the game. And you can argue that out of all of Valve's story-driven games that their original hit title is the one to have the weakest ending. But that depends who you ask. Compared to the original game, the development of Black Mesa was incredibly long, with its origins tracing back all the way to the release of Half-Life 2 in 2004. Released simultaneously on the same day as the sequel, Valve also released Half-Life Source, a port of the original game to the new and improved Source engine used for its sequel. It notably disappointed many fans given the port to a new engine was really all that it was. Some graphical enhancements and gameplay improvements were completed for the release, but it left much to be desired for those who were hopeful for a more comprehensive overhaul of the game, especially given the lack of new textures and models. This would inspire modders to create 2 volunteer projects that would eventually form Crowbar Collective, the development team who would go on to release their remake under the moniker of Black Mesa, which would see its official Valve-endorsed early access release on Steam in 2015. Upon its early access release, the game itself was pretty much complete, with the exception of one critical portion of the game, Xen. Aware of the negative perception that the original Xen had, the team behind Black Mesa wanted to ensure they didn't make the same mistake, or at the very least, created an interpretation of the dimension that would be faithful to Valve's ideas, but simultaneously fit within their own art style and design. Instead of recreating Xen one-to-one like earlier portions of the game, the Crowbar Collective team decided to remake it completely from scratch, such as designing their own unique Xen fauna, biomes, and even creatures. This attention to detail and consideration for making sure that it was what they felt was right and innovative is what led to the team taking an additional 5 years to develop Xen before its full release in 2020. It was worth the wait. Fans and critics alike raved about their beautiful and unique interpretation of an area of Half-Life that generally lacked charm as compared to the rest of the game, with IGN's Dan Stapleton stating, "The completely reimagined Xen section is definitely the best looking of all of the levels." Which makes sense because it's the most recently constructed. It's very much its own distinctively alien setting, and exploring it was novel even for someone who's played all the Half-Life games. Plus, it can only really be an improvement over the lifeless, floating rocks of the original. This was something that Crowbar Collective intentionally sought to accomplish. If you played the original Half-Life and even actually like Xen, it'd be hard not to admit that the platforming and layout of the maps are confusing and downright frustrating at times. Personally, I don't think Valve Xen is bad per se. While the design and geography of the dimension is not as flavorful as the rest of the game, it does elicit this sense of eeriness and even loneliness. Though this does not excuse the frustration that myself and many other players experienced while playing the game. This was something the Black Mesa team kept in mind while still having creative agency over the project. Eurogamer's Rick Lane had similar thoughts, stating, "By comparison, Black Mesa's Xen offers well over an hour's worth of extraterrestrial exploration through landscapes that push the Source engine to its limit. The opening sequence is breathtaking. Gordon stumbles out of the Lambda portal into a vast alien panorama, rocks bobbing in the purplish void ahead of him, partially silhouetted by Xen's ice-blue sunlight. As you approach the precipice of the island you're stood on, a flock of alien birds soars across Gordon's vision as Joel Nielsen's rousing soundtrack swells in your ears." This description is apt to explain the key differences between Valve's Xen and Crowbar Collective's interpretation. In the original Half-Life, your first view of Xen is merely a few islands in an endless void. Grant's review of the original game described it as a mock-up of Purgatory, which can give Valve Xen some merit aside from the frustrating gameplay. Crowbar Collective's, on the other hand, is far more verbose and alien, quite literally. It's less the start of a new chapter and instead the opening shot of a cinematic experience, a product of years of work and imagination. Now that the background of how Black Mesa came to be and why Xen took so long to develop has been covered, it's actually worth focusing on what Lane said about the opening of Xen. The ending portion of the game is a masterclass in level design, music, combat, and motion. As Lane also stated, it takes well over an hour, multiple in fact, to complete the arduous journey to defeat the Nihilith in Black Mesa. I use the word arduous as intentionally as possible here. Parts of Zen, especially the latter half of Interloper, get so repetitive. You're going through the same gameplay and level design for what feels far too long. And yet, you keep going. You get through these parts again and again. You, as a player, are determined to beat this not because of how far you've progressed in your journey, but because of where you started. Let me show you what I mean. The very first section of Zen is the moment you realize that Black Mesa is more than just a game. It is a genuine, bona fide, beautiful work of art. It's akin to the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2, Halo 3, and so many countless other games. I should address the use of the word beauty, because if you're a frequent viewer of mine, you likely know that I use that word pretty liberally. The genuine beauty. Simultaneously, there is somewhat a sense of beauty, but it has an air of beauty to it. It's beautiful. Quite beautiful, actually. The genuine beauty of abstract art. Beauty, to me, is a word that I use when I'm trying to pin down something that I can't fully describe in my writing or narration for these videos. This strong emotion that I feel, I can only see it as a reaction to beauty. I want to emphasize that here, even more than the other times I've used this word, that Black Mesa really does encapsulate beauty. Its development is a testament to the love and care that goes into creating video games. And care Crowbar Collective did. NoClip's documentary on Black Mesa in 2022 offers an incredible deep dive into the development practices of the studio and how they intended to complete their remake of this loathed section of the original Half-Life. They cited how Valve Zen was unfinished, likely the reason for its lackluster environments and generally frustrating gameplay. Certainly, knowing that Valve's version of Zen was rushed in a last-minute addition, Crowbar Collective sought to take their time and make sure that it was done right. This reminds me of a quote I heard once about games, something ubiquitous with good practices in the industry, something any gamer worth their salt can remember to throw out when advocating for games. Not sure I can remember it, though. In NoClip's documentary, the team explains that they developed the Earthbound portion of the game as a near identical copy of Half-Life, whereas Zen was intended to be its own unique thing pretty much from the start. Level designer Chris Horn came up with concept art and created plans to act essentially like a design doc for when the team would inevitably get to Zen's overhaul. With these design principles in mind, Horn pushed to split the development of both the Earthbound and Zen portions of the game in order to be able to actually give the latter half of the game the justice it deserved. In a sense, they were aiming to create a product that would be far grander than a rushed direct remake of Valve Zen. So much so that they landed on the idea to, quote, make it a separate game in itself. At the same time, while they were seeking to craft a unique interpretation of the dimension, they also sought to follow a, quote, Valvean mindset in terms of gameplay and level design. Such aspects of the mindset are unobtrusive tutorials that don't punish you for failing them. We'll come back to that in a bit. An excellent example of this Valvean mindset is actually the clip I showed a few minutes earlier where you see Zen for the first time. It is a masterclass of exposition that introduces your environment, situation, and goal all within the span of 15 seconds. As the screen fades from white after teleporting from the Lambda complex, Gordon breathes heavily as he grabs the crowbar and gets up on his feet. The cave he finds himself in is silent, only adorned by the sounds of water dripping and wind, with the Nihilith saying, comes another. This cave formation is bathed in a deep purple hue and covered with human equipment and items, seeming familiar and calm despite the unfamiliar voice and surroundings. While on the teleport platform, you can visibly see a deep purple sky, much like the lighting within the cave itself. Yet, as you wander outside, a blue hue shifts in as a massive spire comes into view. It's embellished with the sight of voids and X-rays flying past as Joel Nielsen's Transcendent begins to play. Whether it's your first time playing the game or coming back years later to finally play the Zen chapters, you get goosebumps from the sense of wonder but simultaneous horror as you realize the true depths of the situation that you are in. This is far, far away from Black Mesa. This is not home. Yet the area is still peaceful. It's adorned by purple, green, and blue, an intentional color palette chosen by the developers to elicit a sense of relaxation and calm. Despite this tranquility, it is not all peaceful, and one of the very first things you see is the same spire I mentioned a bit ago, surrounded by dark clouds and a red sun that seems to be held within these claw-like rocks. Much like the Citadel in the opening of Half-Life 2, the game makes it obvious that this is where the final showdown is gonna be. This is all within the span of about 15 seconds, and as someone who eagerly waited for the Zen chapters to be completed, it was such an emotional experience when I completed my first playthrough. It feels overwhelming in the best way possible to witness all of this so abruptly and so quickly after jumping through the portal after being on Earth just moments ago. Shortly after leaving the cave, the game introduces another Valvian design. Just minutes before entering Zen, you get the long jump module for the HEV suit, giving you the ability to rocket forwards in order to traverse large gaps. Given Zen's reduced gravity, it's a tool that proves important to navigate across the islands that scatter the dimension. The first proper tutorial on teaching the player how to traverse the dimension is when a ramp must be lowered by the player to cross a large gap. A convenient red lever shows the player exactly what they need to interact with in order to actually lower the ramp. If you don't pay attention while traversing the gap, you're likely going to be caught by a barnacle overhead, which would spell a deadly end for you. If you are able to kill the barnacle before it eats you, then you end up falling. In this case, you're fortunate enough to fall into a pool of water. This teaches the player that there can be potential hazards like barnacles that, if caught by, may prove fatal. In this specific case, the game doesn't punish you for the first failure. You avoid taking any damage, and the game drops you back onto the ground where a convenient cliff face can be traversed to get back up to the ramp. Just a few minutes later, you come across an incredibly similar trial to the last. Barnacles adorn the ceiling, and a ramp shows the starting point to get across the gaps. And there appears to be some safety if you fail to jump or get caught in a barnacle. Except, this is hardly the case. Right after jumping from the ramp onto a platform, you see an ichthyosaurus jump in the air after depositing a spool of wire into a barnacle's sucker? I don't really know what you call it. Regardless, the game is introducing elements to situations that make them more conducive to a challenge. The environment is no longer safe to fail in. You have to make this jump. At this point, it should become apparent what these two sections are meant to do. The first is to make an example of the potential hazards of navigating Zen with the long jump module. The second is an iteration on that first section with some teeth. It is meant less as a comfortable familiarization with the level's concepts, and instead creates a fail state that forces a player to apply the knowledge in a higher stake situation. This is the Valvian mindset that I mentioned earlier, and is a design motif present in numerous Valve titles. A perfect example of this in a Valve game is at the end of the Sand Traps chapter in Half-Life 2, where you encounter a rebel named Laszlo being devoured by antlions. It's not as subtle as other examples, but it demonstrates that you need to stay off the sand in order to save precious ammo.
Don't step on the sand, it makes the antlions crazy! Laszlo, don't move! No, help!
In a sense, it calls upon the idea of audience involvement in art. Marcel Duchamp, an artist who helped lead the Dada movement, has written that, all in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act. In these scenarios, you have developers who have created situations for a player to interact with and contribute to. With Laszlo and the antlions, you can follow the directions of the rebel and save him, while you can simultaneously ignore his instructions, causing him to issue an aggressive response.
You there! Stop where you are! Stay on the rocks! Idiot! Walking on the sand brings antlions after you!
While copying Valve design motifs is one thing Crowbar Collective did that imitates the original game, as stated earlier, they took plenty of liberty in designing their own themes and environments for their interpretation of Zen. In NoClip's documentary, the team revealed that each chapter of the game had an intended theme. Mentioned briefly, the Zen chapter itself was meant to be tranquil, with calming colors and soft, simple shapes, and a focus on the local wildlife. This is very much reflected in the fact that even the enemies follow this principle, with the presence of the squishy hound eyes, plump barnacles, and these weird, shocking lamp things. You can also find protozoans floating around, which, unlike the other monsters, are completely friendly and bear no hostility towards the player at all. They are just floating around. Gonarch's Lair, on the other hand, is a chapter which starts to shift the mood from peaceful to paranoid. The colors of this chapter are orange and yellow, and you start to notice that you're getting closer and closer to the tower seen at the opening of Zen. In addition to the colors, there are more subtle changes like the addition of angular shapes seen in the form of crystals or columns. The chapter Interloper makes the progression of change the most obvious, with an extreme abundance of red washing over the entire chapter. It connotates a sense of danger as you start to approach the base of the tower. Unlike the Zen chapter, where enemies are limited, and Gonarch's Lair, which is largely the boss fight against the Gonarch itself, this is a chapter that goes on for a long time, and makes use of those aforementioned angular shapes and the oppressive hue change to paint such a tonal shift for the game. It also focuses on combat and puzzles far more than the previous two chapters. This part of Zen uses its aesthetics to communicate to the player that the game isn't messing around anymore, and they create the challenges to back this fact up. Throughout these chapters, you get closer and closer to the spire, before eventually getting to the top and fighting the Nihilith. While the portal exists, the spire itself isn't present in the original Half-Life whatsoever, and is very much an artistic addition to likely emulate the same progression seen in the Rebellion portion of Half-Life 2, as you get closer and closer to the Citadel until you finally reach the top. Consider how the opening of Half-Life 2 has the Citadel as the very first thing the player sees upon leaving the train station. It positions itself as a unique piece of scenery given its contrast to the environment it is found in. The spire in Zen is this dastardly, evil structure standing among the peaceful, calm colors of the rest of the dimension, whereas the Citadel in Half-Life 2 is this dull, dark, super tall structure imposing itself over European architecture. To signify progress to the player, there are plenty of spots throughout the entirety of Zen which are essentially just scenic overlooks that get closer and closer to the spire. A lot of them have healing pools that offer a glimpse into space with the spire looming in the distance. It doubles both as a checkpoint and also makes the wait more interesting. You get to idle in this abundant alien world for a moment. The scenes and colors make these waits so much more interesting than just sitting and staring at an HEV suit charger in Black Mesa. Of course, Crowbar Collective developed plenty of their own ideas to truly create a unique Zen. Some of the most notable details are present within the first 10 minutes of gameplay, where you discover an abandoned lab started by Lambda team scientists. As an artistic addition, it's extremely unique to Black Mesa, as the original Half-Life had very little indication that there were ever any humans in Zen at all, with there only being a few HEV suits lying around the dimension. The closest we get to actual human habitation in Zen is seen in Gearbox Software's Half-Life Blue Shift, with a small cave camp. And that's not even a game Valve developed themselves to begin with. In order to create a dimension that was completely fresh to old and new Black Mesa players alike, the team decided to improve the ties of Zen to Earth itself. The lab that you discover early in the Zen chapter is entirely unique to the game, and its intention is to build upon the work of the Lambda team. While this adds a feeling of familiarity and shows that humans made progress in colonizing Zen, it also simultaneously shows the opposite. The human habitat and research stations present throughout the Zen swamps reflect the peaceful nature and ease of survival for the scientists until the habitat was destroyed. In fact, the furthest we see scientists in HEV suits is as far as Gonarch's Lair, showing that the Lambda team truly struggled to get beyond the peaceful environments of the Zen swamps. Any attempt to make further encampments or even to kill the Gonarch resulted in failure. This is both visually apparent by the lack of human camps in Gonarch's Lair, but also through information on whiteboards seen in the habitat. The notes on the board indicate that the team was well aware of the danger of the Gonarch, with early encounters proving to be fatal. This is supported by a whiteboard in the same area that also shows a missing team, one that can be found strewn throughout the Gonarch's Lair. One distinct subtlety in Zen that you don't really notice unless you're paying close attention is the lack of vortigaunts leading up to Interloper. Until that chapter, they are completely absent, and are instead replaced by existing Half-Life enemies and even new variants designed by Crowbar Collective, such as the HEZs, Underwater Barnacles, Suicide Hound Eyes, and Alpha Hound Eyes. According to the team, this was a very intentional choice. Your first interaction with Vortigaunts is an interloper, where you first hear them weeping before witnessing them cowering in fear as one of their brethren are beaten by alien grunts. Killing the grunts and leaving the Vortigaunts to live causes them to flee and cower in fear, a far cry from the aggressive and deadly attacks levied against Gordon earlier in the office complex. The game has already taught you that Vortigaunts are enemies, but this is the first instance where that expectation is dispelled. If you do end up killing this group purely out of habit, the area immediately after would prove that the idea of them being passive is correct, as a Vortigaunt lets you out of an inescapable room after his friend refuses to do so. After opening the gate, he gestures to come forward while uttering two friendly galungas.
Galunga. Galunga.
The lack of Vortigaunts in Zen up until this point was an intentional choice. It was done so in order to quickly change the player's perception of Vorts as enemies, and actually ends up showing their true nature. If you're unfamiliar with what a Vortigaunt is and their story, then you begin to understand that their killing of humans is not intentional. They're forced to do so by alien controllers. This is made readily apparent after Gordon activates a console which triggers an alarm, summoning the controllers who then begin to take over the minds of the Vortigaunts, causing their eyes to turn red and forcing them to attack Gordon. Of course, you have the option to kill the controlled Vortigaunts or free them from their psychic captivity by killing the controllers. It presents an interesting ethical and moral dilemma that wasn't really seen in the original game. In the original Half-Life, the second section of Interloper does have what appears to be some sort of Vortigaunt camp, with a few being passive to the player. This is pretty much the only instance of this happening, so it's not particularly surprising that you would just kill them out of habit, especially given that some of them do still attack you. Moreover, the quote-unquote village in the original game pales in comparison to the Crowbar collective interpretation. Not only is it readily apparent that this is some form of municipality given the presence of buildings, but each one that the player goes through also has signs of life, such as campfires, beds, shelves, and pottery. There is even art along the walls, not even showing that these Vortigaunts have homes, but that they have unique culture, an aspect completely lacking in the original game. The morality of being in Zen as Gordon Freeman is something that you don't really consider until you think about it. In the original Zen, it's really just a silent void with no real life or air of beauty to it. To again quote Jules Grant of the Electric Playground, there is only Valve's mock-up of purgatory and eerie wind noises. You don't exactly feel like you belong there, but at the same time you have no reason to care about leaving any alien alive. After all, you've battled Vortigaunts and alien grunts on Earth, so why wouldn't you kill them and any other alien you find? Black Mesa, on the other hand, uses the aliens in their environments to develop a subtle ethical dilemma that you may not normally consider. As stated in NoClip's documentary on the game, the devs intentionally portrayed the Gonarch as an antagonist, compared to Half-Life where Gordon is really portrayed as the antagonist instead. Killing the Gonarch in Black Mesa does make sense. After all, Gordon doesn't really instigate any type of battle. All he does is attempt to activate the teleporter, which by coincidence causes the Gonarch to dig out of the ground and destroy the teleporter. This is actually a great example about how Valve's silent protagonists can actually enhance a scene such as this. At the same time, you, the player acting as Gordon, may feel determined to kill the Gonarch either out of self-defense or rage after it destroys the teleporter and delays your goal of getting to the spire. While the Gonarch is certainly more cut and dry in this respect, there is absolutely some underlying symbolism of invading this seemingly peaceful universe to massacre the local wildlife. A good example of this is while navigating the tranquility of the Zen swamps. The moment you first come across the swamps is upon leaving the human habitat in the first section of the chapter. Immediately after leaving, Joel Nielsen's Entangled begins to play as you encounter the absolutely beautiful Zen swamp that lies in front of you. Large, luscious trees and flowers embellish the entire area, all while simultaneously bathed in a dark green hue. It feels almost like a jungle, and that's further supported by a Zen tree immediately impaling a bull squid right in front of you. A massive tree even looms overhead, somewhat giving off the feeling of a dream or a fantasy world as you long jump across giant leaves and branches. Then, you encounter Hound Eyes running through the forest, who you promptly massacre. Obviously, they've been portrayed as enemies throughout the entire game, and they're always hostile, so of course you're going to kill them. At the same time, the entire process of navigating these beautiful swamps while massacring Hound Eyes, bull squids, barnacles, and all other forms of wildlife presents an interesting juxtaposition. All of these creatures are, of course, enemies, but you can't help but feel like an antagonist in this scenario. After all, Zen is where these creatures call home, and like the humans that came before, you enter their habitat as an unwanted guest, slaughtering them in your quest to slay the Nihilith. In fact, you could even argue that humans instigated the entire conflict, bar the resonance cascade itself. In the questionable ethics chapter, we actually see that the Black Mesa research facility was secretly capturing and studying specimens from Zen. However, not long after, the humans started being collected instead. There's a line spoken by a Lambda scientist that states this outright.
Quite a few handsome specimens were collected from the border world and brought back this way. Before the survey members started being collected themselves, that is.
In some ways, it's somewhat ironic how Gordon is portrayed as the protagonist in this sense. At the same time, Gordon was completely unaware of this, but nonetheless, after learning this, has no issue with killing the aliens that the humans first disturbed. As a player, you're accustomed to pressing on with the gameplay. Half-Life is an FPS, and earlier sequences in the game create danger you are forced to respond to with violence. You're given weapons when you're supposed to fight off the first sights of these aliens back at Black Mesa. Just the same, the military doesn't let up unless you get through them guns blazing. The game has spent a long time training you to view anyone other than the player who is as actionable as you are as a threat. By the time you get to Zen, the escalation of both the aesthetics and challenges might drive the same response out of a player. It is through looking at it again that we see that Zen is not all danger. These delicate, precise choices are made to show us this beautiful world. The creatures therein can be helpful, and yet we press on. Because the power that instigated all of this is still a threat, and everyone standing in our way is an obstacle. Black Mesa, through this fully realized Zen, re-examines the choices and agency you have as a player of a first-person shooter game. Upon entering Zen, you probably feel sympathetic towards your fellow deceased scientists laying around the peaceful fauna. Really, when you think about it, there's just an aura of cruelty to it. Something that the original Half-Life pretty much lacks entirely. Black Mesa drops the cut-and-dry alien invasion approach for more of a mindset that makes you understand these creatures are not intentionally attacking you. The resonance cascade allows for the bridge between worlds to form, but I highly doubt that a headcrab is teleporting itself to Earth rather than the Neolith being the one to force this invasion of Earth to happen. I've talked for a while now about how the development and design choices done by Crowbar Collective for developing Black Mesa. So why go into so much detail about all of this when a full-blown documentary and multiple retrospectives already exist about the game? The point isn't to say, look at how good Black Mesa is and how much care they put into it. Instead, I'm trying to get the idea across that the thought and care put into the game is extremely important. I stated earlier in the video that Black Mesa is a beautiful game, and I really mean that. What it really shows is that, like many, many games in existence, there is thought and very delicate care to details as simple as color and shapes to get across the feeling and mood of an environment. Sure, you may just run and gun for the entirety of the game and have a blast, but you may never notice or even care about the small details like the whiteboards that expand upon the world of Half-Life. This is of course not anywhere nearly exclusive of an idea to Black Mesa. A game will always be good if there is thought and care put into it, if there is intention behind ideas and concepts presented to the player. It's a delicate balancing act of having enough content to satisfy a player while simultaneously avoiding bloat and having too much content that doesn't serve either a gameplay or narrative purpose. At the start of the video, I stated that video games, much like paintings and movies, are equally valid as art. This is certainly not an opinion unique to myself, but it's something that needs to be stated more often. Games have long been stigmatized or viewed as a lesser to all art forms. The late Roger Ebert, in his article, "Video Games Can Never Be Art," denied the idea that a game could tell compelling stories between its levels. When the ESRB was created in 1993, it was out of a fear that a game like Mortal Kombat would cause kids to be violent. The way that violent video games are interactive have created contentious views forever, and even Ebert would call Waco Resurrection, quote, "one more brainless shooting gallery," without ever playing it. Games aren't art, they make you violent and they aren't able to tell stories. While it's largely fear-mongering, it also distracts from the thoughts and care game developers take to create their games. In a similar respect, it's reminiscent of the Hollywood production code that filmmakers used as a form of self-censorship in the early 20th century. It came from a point of view that ignored how expression in art is important, and denying that is disrespectful, if not insulting. To continue using Black Mesa as an example, shortly after the release of the game in 2020, the team published a map titled Zen Museum to the game's Steam Workshop. It was, as described, just a digital museum showcasing older versions of maps made for each chapter of Zen, allowing you to go back as far as the block-out stages of map design all the way to the final product. One of the most prevalent examples was the creation of the Barnacle Cave I talked about earlier. It started with a sketch by level designer Chris Horn, which went through incremental yet dramatic changes to reach the final product. What started as an environment similar to the original Half-Life Zen changed from a dull green cave all the way to a tranquil and luscious blue biome with some incredible graphics. Certainly, even beyond Source Engine games, it is a fantastic visual experience, even far more impressive than the caves created for Dear Esther, another Source Engine-based game. The reason I bring up the development of the cave is that it acts as an example of the labor of love that goes into creating a game. Programming is an essential and important part of game development, but I would argue that art and design is also just as important. It shows us the process of how the developers of the game approached the design and adjusted their interpretation. We can of course see that the early versions were reminiscent of the dull, flat colors of the original Zen, whereas the final product is completely different but in its own unique way. It allows us as critics and consumers to understand this process, and is half the reason I can even analyze the development of the game in the first place. Amazon Games CEO Christoph Hartmann did an interview with IGN, where he stated that, when we talk about AI, first of all, hopefully it will help us to have new gameplay ideas, which has nothing to do with taking work away from anyone. And especially for games, we don't really have acting. The majority of the team sits in programming, and that's not going to go away because that's all about innovation. Hartmann follows this up by stating that AI could be helpful with, quote, the boring parts, such as localization. At first, you might be inclined to agree with him, but consider that localization itself is also very much an art. Translating a word like death from English to another language can sometimes result in a term that does not mean end of life. At the same time, context and cultural differences also make localization important for creative writing. A great example of this is the old man in Viridian City in the Pokemon games. In the Japanese version of Red and Blue, the man is passed out in the street because he is drunk, whereas in the American and European versions, he just needs his coffee. You could translate this directly to English, but this shows how sometimes localization is creative, but also important for things like censorship in this case. The impression that video game development is largely programming is oversimplifying the process of making a game. Admittedly, Hartmann does try to save face by stating that, by the way, I don't believe any technology can replace human creativity and uniqueness. There's always something special. Humans will be always, when it comes to that, they will always be one step ahead. Though it really does feel like he's trying to say that, hey, art is important too, without really giving any credit where it's due. That right there is the point I want to get across. Game development is not just simply writing in C# or any other programming language. It's also writing in narrative, it's concept in art, it's composition of music. It is care and attention to detail to make a product that has meaning and humanity to it. AI could never consider the antagonistic relationship between the Gonarch and Gordon Freeman in the original Half-Life. It doesn't read into that relationship. It doesn't know how. For the record, I'm not saying that AI is bad or that it can't be used in a medium like game development. However, the entire reason good games are good is because there is a human touch to them. The insinuation that AI could replace cultural and human ideas is not just foolish, but inconsiderate to all game developers. Black Mesa took 16 years to develop. That's a long time, but it was time spent making sure that the game felt right and that it followed their vision. The original release of Black Mesa was 12 years ago in 2012. Even though the game in its entirety, with the exception of Zen, was available for 7 years until Zen beta testing in 2019, the existing completed portions of the game underwent numerous changes to truly perfect the vision over that time. Let's say humanity gets to a point where you could ask an AI to create a remake of the original Half-Life. It could do it, but what would it be? Maybe it would make new textures or models, but it's going to just be a remake. AI doesn't have the capability to say, let's remake this, but maybe we should fix things that weren't great, or maybe we should redo this bit. There wouldn't be any of this painstaking thought put into every detail and design choice. An AI wouldn't consider the morality of hunting down a creature like the Gonarch. It would probably just give it new textures. Seriously, if you haven't watched NoClip's documentary on the development of the game, watch it. Even if you're not a video game person, the amount of thought and reason into every decision is absolutely fascinating. I should be absolutely clear that of course, Kovar Collective is not the only team that does this. Thousands and thousands of independent developers and teams alike do the exact same thing. Black Mesa acts as an example of the work that programmers, artists, musicians, writers, and so many more do to create a game. A lot of times in the modern gaming space, you hear about games that are rushed and unfinished. But generally, The real story behind these pushed releases aren't the developers themselves. It's a corporation or another overarching power that forces them to release a product they are not proud of. All of this attention to detail and work that developers do should be praised. It should be recognized that whether someone is a programmer or a story writer, they are all artists working together to create their art piece. Video games are a new format. Sure, they've been around for over 40 years, but consider how art, like music and painting, has been around for generations. Right now, it might seem strange to consider video games art, but I would argue that they are the ultimate form of art. They involve paintings and sketches, they involve musical compositions, they involve movies in the form of cutscenes, they involve math, science. It is the penultimate harem of all forms of expression to create worlds and stories that, even if they're impossible in real life, remain possible to emulate in the digital world. With that, I'd like to extend a huge thank you for sticking through this video. What was as simple as me just wanting to replay Black Mesa came with this realization that video games are legitimate art, as strange as that sounds. And I really hope that if you haven't learned something or had a similar retrospective, that you enjoyed the celebration of what game developers do. Obviously, I've been using Black Mesa as an example, but you can equate this to almost every video game in existence. Now, I've said plenty of times in the last few months that there's more stuff coming right around the corner, there's a huge project on the way, get hyped! And then nothing happens, but I promise that I'm being real this time. Lots of stuff is right around the corner. So if you'd like to keep up to date with that, and if you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribe! I would like to extend a massive thanks to my friend Ale for their help in editing this script. Beyond script editing, they are a very talented artist, and I highly suggest you check out their stuff in the description. As always, I hope you're having a good day. And then if you're not, remember that tomorrow is a new day. Peace and love, my friends.